If you're interested in web development, specifically with Next.js and Vercel, this episode is for you. Joining me today is Tim Neutkens, Next.js lead over at Vercel and one of the earliest people to join and start contributing. With over 1 million developers actively using Next.js, a lot of things have changed, big time. He shares how things started, what has changed, and where it's headed. So enjoy. Yeah, it's incredible. Like Next.js has gotten so huge. I first saw it, for me, it was about 6 years ago. And now it's past more than 1 million developers. That's insane.
Yeah.
How long ago did you get in touch with it and how'd you get started with it?
So I've been at Vercel for almost 7 years. And I started contributing to it a year earlier than that. So it's almost 8 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's already over 8 years now because we released it in October 2016. It wasn't working at Vercel at the time, so I just saw it in like open source. Basically, I was involved in the Vercel community for a bit, like working on other things.
Mm-hmm.
So there was like they had multiple like open source projects that were relatively popular at the time. Like nothing in the numbers that you see today in open source, but they had like thousands of like stars on GitHub. So that was like pretty big at the time.
Yeah.
And I just found it really interesting, like what they were doing, and they were building a like terminal with webtag called Hyper. I was contributing to that and to like plugins for it. And then basically in the end, like I reached out to Guillermo to basically say, hey, if you ever want to hire like anyone, let me know. And he was like, yeah, we were a really small company. Like it was 5 people at the time, I think, or something like that. And he was like, but have a look at this like new thing we're building called Next.js. And I was like, this is pretty interesting. Like it's like I was doing a lot of PHP development at the time. Like I was building in like WordPress and Magento and Symfony and like that kind of thing. And basically what we did in the end is like I started contributing there because I found it really interesting and looked really like a lot like PHP to me, at least at the time. Like it was like create like pages index and then like pages index is a route, and it's like very similar to index of PHP and the way that works. So it's like kind of like if you get like PHP but has a component model with React and you can build apps that way where like I saw with at least in the applications that I was building at this agency I worked for, like people were like copying the same code a lot. So they would either like this button needs to be used here, so we'll just copy the HTML and CSS for that to this other place. Or like even across apps, right? Like that was a big thing. Like we work in an agency, you should probably know, like there's a lot of customers as well. And they all have like very, at least for UI, it's like very similar needs. Like it's always buttons, drop downs, menu bars, and like the variants of menu bars, that kind of thing. But what I saw is that they were, the company I was working for was recreating them every time that you start a new customer. And I was like, this could be better, I think. And like with this, like React was getting a bit more popular at the time. Like not everyone knew about it, but at least like there was like some like model to do this. And like, I mean, like in the long run, like we've seen that like UI frameworks are here to stay. Not just React, like Vue and Svelte and Solid and like all these other like libraries. They're just they're here to stay, and like we're going to like build apps in this way for quite a long time, I think. Even if it's not React, like if you're using like another UI library, like you're still basically building on the same concepts, right? Like the statement is just slightly different, and like the way that the outputs are generated and things like that. But in the end, like you're still like componentizing your app, and that's the core like win that we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah. So you started actively contributing to Next.js when it was open source then?
Yes. Yeah. So not before. It was like after after they open source, and like then I think like a month later or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. And when did Vercel kind of pop up? Was that around the same time or was that after?
The company was started in 2015, and they were building it was called Site at the time, and they were building like a hosting platform, but it was a single command to deploy a website. So you have a PHP website or or like Node.js website or anything like that. You would run now, which is the CLI command, and it would just deploy it for you. And then you get like a magical like URL that you can share with your colleagues, or you could put it in production and then see serve that as like live traffic. And that basically like evolved over time into more like serverless offering. Initially it was like all Docker, now it's all serverless. And basically like over time we built out like all the core like tooling you need in order to build a website, to either like build it and then deploy it in production with preview URLs. Those are the URLs that you can share with like your colleagues or your customers or things like that. And that was really because I found like Next.js I found really interesting, but also that like concept of having a like almost like a staging environment for every single commit that you're doing is really powerful. And saw that in like working at this agency as well. They had like one staging server where everyone was like merging their changes into, and it's still like the way that most people work nowadays, I think. But in practice, like what I found is that that causes a lot of like conflict as well. Like you got like merge conflicts, or someone merges their changes, but the changes to the database are not the same, or things like that. And it just caused like the staging environment to break continuously. And that's also the URL that you're sending to customers. So like your customer is now seeing that you're like messing up in some way.
Like the reliability is not there if it breaks all the time.
Yeah, and like we would get at the agency, we'd get like customers calling like, hey, we're trying to watch the staging environment, but the staging environment doesn't work anymore. Can you add another staging environment in front of
a stable one?
Like so like you would call that like pre-production or something like that. That is the thing that they use to verify the changes that you're doing are correct as well and look good.
It's really funny because I joined Xebia around 6 years ago, and then the first project I got on, it was using Gatsby and it was using Netlify. And Netlify had those deployable branches, deployable commits as well. Yeah, I was like, this is insane, right? I make a branch, I make the changes, I just send that change specifically before it's even merged, and I loved it. And Gatsby even, like I was really fond of it back in the day, but nowadays it's gone. Like I've been out of front-end development specifically, but I definitely know Gatsby's not as big as it used to be, yet Next.js is. Like, why do you think Next.js survived where Gatsby kind of perished? Because for me, Netlify, Vercel, they were kind of neck and neck, Gatsby and Next.js as well. Yeah. And then also in an organization, I had a new CTO and he was like, we're going to migrate from Gatsby to Next.js. I was like, that's interesting.
So I'm not sure about the whole part about Gatsby, but I do know about the Nexus part. That's like, we did fill in all the gaps that people were asking us for. So a really big thing, like around that time, I think that you were mentioning, is that we launched like Next.js 9 point something that had static generation, but not static generation in the like SSG static website sense, which is like what Gatsby output. It's like so. Let's talk about like what does Gatsby do first. So Gatsby in the first version and like the first few versions, it only had static site generation. Yeah, and that basically means you get some data from somewhere. In this case, I was using GraphQL, but like, let's not talk about that at all. But what it does in practice is it would take the data, render your React components with the data, and then output them to static HTML on disk. And then you use that output, so like this out directory or something like that, to put it on a static web host. So that it could be Vercel, but it could be like anything else as well, like the Pages or Netlify or like AWS S3, so something like that.
Yeah.
But that's only static data. So you have to rebuild every time you make a change to the data. So that means this like generation process, this like build step, basically, you always have to run that after you make a change to the data as well as to the code. Usually you do a build after you change the code, because then like otherwise it's not live
it's not
as well.
There.
But for data changes, that becomes a bit of like a hassle, because you have to rebuild the entire app in order to get this like one change out. So you make a typo in your blog post and you say, I added like a double character there or something like that. You delete that. Now you have to click save, and the save will trigger like a rebuild of the entire app. And if you're doing hundreds of changes per day, which is very common for like these larger websites that are using static generation, you would get into this problem where you would just get like a build queue. So like there would be a queue of like these builds need to run, because you also don't want to run them all at the same time. And some could be canceled in between as well, right? Because if there's a newer change, then like this build is no longer needed. So that's what static site generation does. And then like Next.js was doing the complete opposite at the time. So at the time, it would be a fully dynamic website.
Yeah.
So you create a website, you have basically same concept. You need data, you need like components to render. Like we pass the data into the components and we render that using React, and it creates an output. But all that happens in a web server, and this web server is serving all the requests that are coming to the website. So you go to the website, you get like a render of that particular page for you in particular, but there's nothing for you in particular on the page, right? Like it's always the same data that you're showing. If I go to the website, same thing. There's like no logged in state or anything like that. And because of that, you end up like wasting resources. So in this case, you would re-render too much. You would continuously, like every time, it's like doing the build every time you get a request, basically, for this static page.
Yeah.
Excluding all the JavaScript being generated and that kind of thing. But so they sound very similar, right? Like it's you get data, you render it, and you serve it to a user. But the one is dynamic, so every user gets its own response that is unique, but it's actually not unique. And the other is you do it all at build time, and then you like everyone gets the same response.
Yeah, from the server.
So yeah, from the static like bucket that you're hosting somewhere. So what you want to do, or like what we were thinking was like, cache control headers. Like they work in CDNs. You can add like cache control for a server, and then you basically say, this dynamic response is actually static. And now you can say, cache it for 1 second, or cache it for like a day or something like that. And you can also invalidate those. So you can say, let's invalidate, like on your CDN, you can say invalidate this particular pod. The problem there was that we found that like not everyone knew about it. And it was really hard to educate people on the particulars of cache control.
Yeah.
Especially because cache control has like many directives. So like you also need, like next to saying cache this for like 10 seconds, you also need to say, you know what, let's not revalidate it like on demand. So what that means is that if you do a request to the page and like that time is expired, suddenly everyone that goes to this page is going to get like a response from the server instead, because there's no cache anymore. Like there's the cache item is expired.
Yeah.
But really, we don't want that, because like, what if you get like very high traffic, right? Like if you get hundreds of thousands of people going to your website, and that happens and it expires, then suddenly it's going to be serving like 100,000 requests from the server, and maybe the server can't handle that, or your database can't handle that.
You're going to get bombarded, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So there's this other directive called still while revalidate, which came out around the same time we released this. And it got like more adoption in like CDNs as well, and like Vercel CDN supports it, obviously, that kind of thing. But basically what we found is like this still or revalidate behavior is actually really nice for static websites. So it gets rid of this problem where you're saying, generate this at build time and then never generate it again until we do another build. Because we can say, if you go to a route and it's expired, serve the still like cache entry still. And then in the background, generate a new cache entry.
Yeah.
So that was the like the big thing that we released. And then like APIs around doing the static generation for like a part of your app. So what we found as well is that like most people we talked to were these are like larger companies, right? Not so much like smaller users, but the smaller users also benefited a lot from this because they were building their own personal websites, right? So if you build your own personal website, like high likelihood is that Guillermo would send your personal website that you're tweeting about to me and say, this site is slow, but why is it slow? And then I would be like, dynamic rendering and this is not ideal for your personal website or my personal website. So get like a new like website that someone released on Next.js that was where the person is super happy, like insanely happy that they were like, Next is amazing, yada yada. And we were like, we actually don't like this. No. We like it in terms of like the thing that they build is really cool and like the website looks amazing and things like that. But then you look at the actual like performance numbers and it just didn't make sense for the type of app that they were building. And it was continuously sending the same response, right? There was nothing on your personal website that's going to say, hey, you're Tim, so like here's something else.
Yeah.
So basically we added this way to create partially dynamic, partially static apps based on the route level, saying like on the route level, you could say this page is static, this page is dynamic. And that allows you to basically say, my marketing pages are static, but actually they might not be fully static in terms of like they're static, but also they have data that changes. And obviously you could do like fully static where you don't have any data and like the data, like the thing on the page only changes when you change the code. So that would be like MDX or something that's not remote, basically something that you don't fetch data for. But what we found the most like impactful was like getting to this place where you could do static and dynamic in one app, call it sort of like hybrid websites, applications, because it allows you to say my dashboard is dynamic. It uses like got server-side props, and my marketing pages are static by adding got static props.
I love that. From the story, it sounds like you really listened to kind of what the market needed, or at least your customers were saying, or what problems they had, and that's what you implemented and improved. It was definitely it was something that we had to like add at some point, just because we saw like so many people struggle with it. So it was like not even someone. It wasn't like a customer telling us like, "Hey, my website is slow." They were like, "No, Next is amazing. Like we're way more productive in what we're doing." Partially also because they switched from something that didn't have components, for example. That helps.
That helps a lot in feeling more productive as well, or like building pages out quicker. But also they were like, Next is really like it's working for us really well. And then like we were looking at their performance and it was just like it's good. It's not bad. It's just that it's like 500 milliseconds for a page that could take 30 milliseconds or something like that.
Were you that like specific focused on performance? Like with the builds and with speed, and was that the number one, let's say, target to look at?
Not the number one target per se, but we always optimized for 3-4 things. So so one is performance, like your actual application performance is really important to us. The overall like the benefit that you get from adopting Next.js is that you get compared to like other applications that you've built, you get better performance, but also because like we try to nudge you towards like static generation, for example, that you couldn't do before and things like that. The other is security. It's like really important that you build secure apps and developer experience. Right? So like we were like one of the early frameworks that like started to focus on developer experience. So like getting like really good error messages, and they could still be better. Like we're not there yet. But so error messages, fast refresh, so like React's fast refresh. We started implementing that. So it basically allows you to change your code while like all state on the page stays the same. So that means if you toggle the dropdown will stay open if you're using React State for that. Or like anything else really, like if you type something in a form, that kind of thing. And then, that's like most of it is like DX, performance, security, and like overall, performance is also like it's such a wide thing because it's like UX, so like user experience, like that kind of thing, but also like DX related, so like performance in like build tools, so like getting the builds to be faster, getting your development to be faster, that kind of thing.
That's what I mainly looked at when using tools or when adopting tools. Is like developer, I call it also satisfaction. Like I love being productive, and the feeling of the tooling that I use in making me more productive is a really big, let's say, hit or miss. Sometimes if there's a paywall, I'm not even going to use a tool. And if there's tools out there free of use and I can see, let's say, the benefits, then you get hooked and you want to do more, right? And then you start looking into the resilience of whatever tooling you use, especially if you use it as a hosting provider. Security definitely needs to be there, because otherwise, why use it in a more larger scale environment? And then indeed performance, like performance that comes out of the box and not necessarily is impacted by how you use it, because how you use it is always going to impact performance. So then you look at what comes out of the box, I would say.
Yeah, and like over time we added these like improvements for UX as well. So like the next image components, for example, is like auto sizing, like resizing the image to a size that makes more sense to your like mobile device. Things like that. Next font, so like being able to import a font that is like does all the best practices for you. So like like if I ever used web fonts, like you probably know the add font face thing, but actually that's just the beginning. So like if you do that, you get some kind of layout shift, because the font that you're falling back to is never the same font that like you wanted to use. So we're doing like this thing where if you're using Next font, it will automatically create like a fallback font for you that is more like the original font that you're trying to load in. And that all has like real like measurable UX like improvements. And then we try to optimize CSS, JavaScript, like all that as well. Obviously, like React is not the smallest library to like bring in, but like we tried to do our best to also like reduce the size of Next.js, for example, in between. Like one good example of that is like App Router is smaller than Pages Router in terms of like size. It has more React, but it has less Next.js. So like React is doing more of what Next.js was doing before, but in smaller size, because it just knows more about the environment. So it can do optimizations that we couldn't do before, or reuse like rendering logic, for example. That kind of thing.
Interesting. In terms of usage, with regards to the customers that you know of, when it comes to peaks in traffic or just general amounts of users, what are like some cool projects that have been deployed with Next.js on Vercel specifically?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if like any like super stand out. Or like what is nice to see is that there's the general distribution of like applications that we're seeing is way more like when we started building it, obviously it was like early adopters. So like we would see like companies like NPM, for example, adopted for their website. And like startups, right? Like a lot of startups in like the Bay Area, like across the world, like CMS providers, like that kind of thing. At this point, what we're seeing is like the full like enterprise scale applications that are being built on Next.js as well. And they're what was interesting to me is that like a lot of the constraints that we added early on, so like getting better development performance or better like UX, for example, or like adding guardrails for like certain UX problems, they they all exist in larger apps as well. Like it's not just the smaller like apps that you were working with back then. Like everyone is benefiting from this. Your personal website, your like massive corporation, and yeah, it's just like it's really nice to see that people are like productive with it, but also get like relatively good like outcomes in performance and user experience as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know you were there like very, very early on, and now we're here where probably the organization has grown 100-fold. I don't even know how much. When it also comes to the amount of engineers that are there, how's your role kind of evolved from where it started to what it is now?
Yeah, so I started when I joined Vercel, it was I think like 10-ish people or something. I can't remember exactly like what number I joined as, but I think we're at the light is blinking.
The light is flickering. Yeah. Give me one sec. Edward, is that something we can do something about? All of a sudden it started flickering. Huh?
Oh.
It stopped.
Stop.
It fixed itself. But yeah, you were around employee number 10, you mentioned?
Yeah, I can redo that part if
yeah.
it's probably better. Yeah. So yeah, I can't remember exactly. So I joined 7 years ago. It was it was only 10 people or so. I can't remember what number I was that I joined as, but we're at I think over 500 people now or something. Mm-hmm. So massive expansion in company size. Now people think like 500 people working on Next.js, like what is this framework? But there's a lot of the Next.js team itself is around like if you count Turbopack as well, it's like 20-ish people at this point. Around 10 working on Next.js.
Yeah,
and it includes like managers and people working on triaging, on like actually fixing bugs and adding new features. Mm-hmm. And we just hired like a really good team working on Next.js.
But that's not all of engineering, right? Out of 500,
so that's like
much?
Out of 500, so that's only 20 people, and then like the rest is like engineering for Vercel platform. So it's like the infrastructure, the like site reliability, the like marketing, like sales, like that kind of thing. Like we built out the whole organization, right? Like it's a very like professional company now. Like we have like a legal team, like communications, like everything you could think of basically for like a business of our scale. And security team also very important. They're also really good. So it's really awesome to see like just like the like everything around the company like professionalizing way more over the last like 5 years or so. Like as we started growing more and more. And yeah, so I joined very early, and like to answer your question on like what changed, I think was like the like when I joined I had to do everything, which meant like literally everything you could think of. It included like replying to people's emails that had like support questions for Vercel, but also like building out Next.js. So like we had a team of like 2 people back then, I think. It's like me and Arnoda. And eventually that turned into just me working on it because Arnoda started working on other things. And like over time, we started hiring like more people into the team. Got some like people that joined as interns, like JJ, who still works on the team. And they like basically in the end, like we ended up hiring him and like some other people. Like I think like we were 3-4 people back then working on Next.js. Kind of switched roles a few times. So back then I switched to being like doing more of management type things. There was just like a lot of need to like gather this feedback from like this like increasing usage of customers and like just general like Next.js users, right? Like back then especially, like you wouldn't see like every company like default to say we're going to consider Vercel, this thing that we've never heard of, that built this thing that we're like so happen to be using. Yeah. But over time that shifted quite a bit. And then we eventually like hired a manager for the team because I was also like kind of need more help, even if I just stay as like doing manager or tech lead type work. And so that over time, we just ended up like hiring the people that we needed. So that could be people working on engineering or management. And in the end, like for me, that meant like switching to the manager role a few times, but also going back and helping out on rolling out certain Next.js features. And so for example, like App Writer and Turbopack helped quite a bit there. Doing like actual coding as well.
It sounds like a lot of fun that you can also kind of have the flexibility to move around now.
Yeah, that was not always the case, obviously. And like there was a lot of like I had to be involved in some way. And now we're at a point where we have like a really good like engineer manager, Jimmy. If you ever have like feedback about Next.js, just reach out to Jimmy as well, or to me. Like, it doesn't matter. I'll forward it. And that just meant that I could focus more on the things that like I felt were really important for Next.js in the future. So one of those is Turbopack, and I've been helping out there quite a bit. And like Turbopack is like our our replacement for the compiler that currently backs Next.js. So that means basically our goal in short is things are too slow. We want to make it faster.
Yeah. I love the name.
That's like the really that's the really fast explanation. The slightly longer explanation is like there's a lot of like the size of applications are like growing quite heavily. So what we see is that every year we end up seeing more and more code being added into applications. Like Chrome team and people looking at web performance, they will say there's more JavaScript in client-side bundles, but also there's more code to be compiled because of that. So that means that the compiler needs to be quite optimized in order to process like tens of thousands of modules, whereas previously we saw like 10,000 modules is like quite large, and like 50,000 was like that's what Facebook is doing or something. And then now it's just like someone adds like an icon library or something like that. There's like 10,000 modules like easily in the icon library, which is really cool because now you can import 10,000 different icons, but also means that we have to process like quite a lot of code in order to make that work. And if you're like not super into this, like it might sound like this thing called tree shaking. I've heard of this before. Like it can get rid of all the code, right? And that's true. But in order to get rid of the code, we first need to know about the code, which means that we need to process all of it. So there's like one of the downsides of like building like a compiler bundler for JavaScript and like the overall ecosystem. But yeah, we've started building something that is looking really good at this point. It's much faster than like Next.js before. So that's like I think like so far we've made a 50% improvement on cold compilation. So that means like if you're using it day to day, 50% faster initial compile. So that means like going to a page, like opening it for the first time, then it compiles it. And then there's the incremental changes where the real like magic happens, which is that anytime you make a change to like say a CSS file or like a JavaScript file, it needs to recompile that change and like apply it to your app. And that is now in many cases under 100 milliseconds, whereas previously it could take like 1-2 seconds sometimes. So we saw for like our own apps, we saw up to 96% like faster. So going from like seconds to a few milliseconds for a lot of those changes.
Incredible.
Yeah, and it's like the thing is like in like all those years, the thing I've heard the most is like Next.js is great, but actually it's quite like slow for compilation, and that's what we're fixing basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you were in, let's say, those more managerial roles and the team was scaling up with regards to engineering capacity, were you also involved in hiring? Yeah. I'm curious what you look at from that hiring standpoint, because I know nowadays the market looks to be a bit more rough than it was, let's say, I kind of think during COVID, it was very much booming. people were switching jobs and there were a lot of engineers being hired.
Yep.
And now it's a bit more tight, I feel like. I don't know if the same opportunities are still there, but what did you look out for back then with regards to hiring?
So what we looked for and like let's talk about the situation that we have, which is very different from like a lot of other companies. So like we have like we have an office, but in San Francisco, we have an office in New York, but we also have like a very large remote workforce. So there's a lot of people in various countries all over Europe, in Asia and like elsewhere as well. Basically like, so for Next.js in particular, which is, it doesn't apply to everyone at Vercel. Let's start there. For Next.js in particular, we tried to hire a bunch of experts in the field as well.
Yeah.
And they weren't always in the most like beneficial locations. So that this meant that we hired someone from like say South Korea, which is like time zone nightmare. But
time zone wise.
so time zone wise, like the overall, I'm not talking about the people, I'm just talking about the time zones. Like, like overall, we hired like really good people from all over the place. And yeah, so time zone wise, like it's really hard to work with like for people here in Europe. So like we're in the Netherlands right now. So in the Netherlands, like you have a 9-hour time difference with San Francisco.
Yeah.
So it becomes really hard to like do any collaboration with people in like in that, like in California basically, or like West Coast. So and the reason for that is that just so, or if you're like calculating now, or if you're in California and watching this, is that our end of day, so like 5 p.m. is your start of the day, right? If you're in San Francisco. So, and there are some ways to fix this or like to make it more pleasant, which is that all your meetings are at 6 p.m. or like 7 p.m. Or you work at nights, but we don't want to do that. So in practice, like for me, that means we schedule meetings at like 6 p.m. usually, or something like that, 5 sometimes. But and that's like beneficial because like then everyone can be there basically. But so so the situation that we have, because I digress. So for the Next.js team in particular and the Turbopack team as well, there's a bunch of people in Europe. There's a bunch of people in the US, but also like kind of spread over the US. So that means in multiple time zones in the US. But in general, you can think of that as like 6-hour time difference with here to 9-hour time difference, because there's like all the other times that are in between that. So it's like 7-8 hours. And someone in Canada as well. So similar thing. So first of all, when I was hiring, I wasn't looking at the time zone. I was just looking at because everyone's remote, someone needs to be like they can be junior, but they have to be really driven and like continuously ask for, like be very like open about like I'm stuck, I need help here. And then
you can't be isolated.
You can't be isolated.
No.
And you can be isolated if you're more like senior, basically. So we ended up hiring a bunch of people that were either really good at like calling out that they were stuck and needed help because they were remote, and you're not in the office, so you just can't see that they're stuck in any way. And or you can notice it at some point, but like that's besides the point. So in the end, like we start looking for people that were like could perform really well under like hard problems being given to them, and they can figure it out either by themselves or like know how to ask the questions to get it solved.
Yeah.
And that like works really well for Next.js. That definitely wasn't the case, or like that definitely wasn't like for all of Vercel per se. It was just like for us that worked the best. We hired a bunch of people contributing to open source, sometimes other open source projects as well. That like worked on similar like problem space. So a good example of that is Joe. He goes by Timer online. If you've never heard of him, you probably thank like if you use React, like you can probably thank him for a lot of getting knowledge about React, because he helped maintain Create Next App or Create React App, and Create React App was used by pretty much everyone to learn React, right? So, so he worked on that, but Create React App is very similar to Next.js in a way that like has similar compiler, similar bundler, like it had all the same problems, and he was working like an error overlay that made like React errors a bit better. So we hired him from like doing that, and like working the team like early on was just like we tried to hire like the most senior people just because they had the experience to start like leveling up Next.js basically. And then we hired some like more junior folks, at least at the time. Like they're really good now. Like they know a lot more than they did back then. So like we would get like drive-by contributors, right? So like the thing that happens in open source is that you get some like one person that opens one PR and then they're gone, basically, right? So usually they have like this squiggly image that's like a default in GitHub. And there you're suddenly like nowadays you're like, this is AI or something like that. But back then it was like, this must be some person that wants to be anonymous or something like that.
Yeah.
But there's a few people that usually that you see that will start contributing more. So they do one PR and then like you land a PR and they're like, awesome, I want to do more. And like they start adding like more like changes into Next.js. And JJ was a good example of that. He would pick up like hard problems, like out of the repo. And when you start doing that's kind of like you like we as maintainers see that and we're like, this is awesome, because like this is a thing that I wanted to do for a really long time, but I just never had the time. And so I reached out to him and I was like, what do you work on? And he's like, I'm a student. Like he was like, I'm not sure what he was studying, but he wasn't even studying computer science, I think.
Oh wow.
And so they like I just reached out. I was like, hey, well, like what are you working on, and why are you even contributing to Next.js then? Basically, it was like, I just found it cool, and then started like helping out. I was like, if you want to do an internship at some point, like let me know, because we can probably work something out. And then like he joined as an intern pretty soon after that, really. Like and he was able to do that next to his school, I think, or something like that. And then eventually, I think he still like graduated and like after that joined Vercel full time.
Really nice. Do you think that still works? Yeah. Like the level of contribution to open source eventually landing you an internship or maybe even a job nowadays?
It depends, because like I don't know if if contributing to open source is like appealing to a company that is not particularly focused on that, right? Like I was so for me personally, I was contributing to open source because I just liked it, and I was like 19, and I just had a lot of time. Like I had so much time.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't do partying or anything like that, so I was just like on my laptop all the time, continuously coding. Sounds very boring to most people probably, but really like doing that, and I just learned a lot from doing that. So like I learned through there were like two things that I learned a lot through, which was like I worked at an agency, and I joined that full time like after I finished school when I was 18, and then so there was a person there, Dwayne, if he watches this at some point, who was like he was like university computer science like masters or something like that.
Legend.
It was like that's like the highest level of computer science you could do here, I think, in the Netherlands. And so he had all this like crazy computer science, like I don't know, like PHP like design pattern stuff, and like I don't know, like and I was just like, this is kind of interesting, and like he noticed that at some point. He was pretty young as well. I think he was like 25 or something. But he noticed that at some point. It was just like continuously, like every time he was doing something, he was like, hey, come look, because we were in the office. That's what I miss about the office, really. But just like come look and like have a look here. Look, this is like some pattern to do this thing, or this is like how you use like Node.js or that kind of thing. And like that really helped a lot because I didn't do a CS degree here at all. I just decided to start working there. And in the end, that was like super helpful. And then like the other thing was that like when I got home after work, I would start contributing to open source and like working on like side projects and doing all kinds of like smaller contributions to open source. And like for Next.js, that was really nice because like early on, it was just like a ton of bugs. So like you would just see like a new bug come up every day and I would just go and do it, like fix it. I didn't know how to fix it. Let's mention that as well. So it's just like, I know some JavaScript. I wasn't even good at JavaScript, I think. There was no TypeScript, just to be clear. It's not very popular back then. So I just started contributing and like trying to figure these things out. And I liked it. It was kind of like puzzling, right? Like putting a puzzle together. It's like, the pieces, but you also don't really know how to fit them together. And you need to figure out like what the, like how they stick together and like what the right solution is. And then when you know the solution, I was very fortunate to have this existing connection with Guillermo and the other people on the Vercel team at the time, where if I figured it out, I could ask them like, hey, does this make sense? And then they were like, makes sense, or they were like, doesn't make any sense, go back and try this other thing that they were suggesting. And it was like, for me, it was really interesting to learn from them as well, because they, like some of them also didn't have a CS degree, but they were just like really good programmers, or really fast programmers, for example. And like one of the things that was also really interesting is that they were already successful in open source, like building good open source software that a lot of people used. So I was just like, maybe this will at some point like be used by more people as well, or like more people can get benefits from this. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting to me that when you say we were hiring people that don't have as much experience, you look for people that are eager, but also call out when they're stuck, right? That's one of the pieces of advice that I got very early on. And I was fortunate to be in an office space. And I also liked the kind of colleagues next to me actually looking out for me and educating me when it comes to something that they really loved, because that's, if they have a passion for something, they share it. But the piece of advice was, well, Patrick, you've been stuck with this. And I know you're stuck, but you're not like calling out for help, right? For me, traditional education kind of gears you towards figure it out yourself, because that's how you learn faster, right? If I have a question, it's like, have you looked it up yourself? Like, are you looking for the answers? Because then they might stick with you more. Whereas in an agency or even consultancy, like we're there for a job. And in the end, yes, there's time for learning, but if you're stuck for a few days, then ask for help, because if someone can help you within 5 or half an hour, 5 minutes or half an hour, then that's just more productive. So that's what you do.
Or even
and
hours,
that's how you learn
right?
faster.
Like,
yeah.
It's even like what I found for myself, at least, is that when you do call it out, is that one of the problems with at least Dutch education, I think, is that, because I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere, but is that you would get, when you do have this question, like it's often like, either figure it out yourself or you didn't study well enough.
Yeah.
Instead of like explaining, maybe you want to learn it, maybe you don't want to learn it. Especially in high school, I had a lot of things that I was just like, why am I learning this? It doesn't make any sense.
No.
Won't throw anything under the bus, but languages is like, and I know why they're useful for some people, but I just found like I did really well in English, but like every other language that they teach you here, I was super bad at, and it wasn't because I couldn't learn it, but it just wasn't interesting. And
no.
So that was the thing that you learn, like once you start working in the office, for example, is like your colleagues are not out to get you in a way, and you can ask them questions and they will try to answer it, or they will be like, don't really have time, but you can ask this other person, right?
Yeah.
Or things like that.
They will always help.
And yeah, because like in the end, like everyone benefits, right? And like what I found like working in an agency, and I was pretty young, like I was 18, 19, is that like everyone was pretty happy to help, but also at some point like people started asking me the questions, right? Like they like other people that joined later were like, how do I do this thing, or how do I do that thing, or like I set up this like, well, it wasn't a framework, but it was like a tool to set up like development environments internally. And in the end, like I was just running all of those like development environments for everyone to make them more efficient. So yeah, it's definitely interesting, and like that's what we try to look for early on. And like over time, obviously, like our like hiring got way more professional as well. So we have like a full interview process now. We have like some like interview where you have to show like technical skill, that kind of thing. But in practice, like the thing that we were looking for at the time when I was a manager was just like people that could execute really well, but and that could bring something new to the team as well, right? So it wasn't like things that I could not do myself, basically. That would be the most like helpful. So like we like a good example of that is we hired Tobias, who created Webpack, to work on Webpack full time, basically. Like that was basic. Like we were like, here's money to start building more into Webpack, but also I have these asks for you that are just like not getting resolved at the time. And there was like a lot of around performance, and like I was pretty good at finding performance issues. So I was like pointing to things, and Tobias is really good at like measuring like this like performance, but also coming up with solutions that are things that I would just never have thought of. And like he did a pretty good CS degree as well. So I know where my limits are as well, personally, and where like other people can help out quite a lot. And like obviously I learned like quite a lot from them as well through that process. Yeah,
that's the best. Yeah, hiring people that you can look up to, that can teach you something and that bring like something new to the table. Yeah, like it's a lot of fun as well working with. First of all, like I like working remotely because I get to experience also people's other cultures, right? You get a very diverse team rather than being in a team with only, for example, Dutch people. Like it's different. I've had that very early at the start of my career, and then I joined another team and it had still in office, but people from like 8 different cultural backgrounds. And I was like, I'm learning a lot professionally, but also like culturally and personally.
Definitely.
That was a lot of fun. And then nowadays, since you can work remote, like the step to do that is just easier. The only challenge is indeed like time zones. It's definitely a thing. Never thought of that. And I've never worked with kind of 9-hour differences either way. That's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. So the time zones are the hardest. I think, one of the coolest things of working at Vercel is that we have such a, like the multicultural team. And even just like, like being Dutch, like you don't see a lot of the world, like growing up per se. Yeah. And it's just like I don't know, like people in the US have such a different work ethic compared to people here in the Netherlands, at least. And this is really like interesting to see that. But we had so many different cultures, like people from Japan, and I got to experience a lot of it as well because I was able to travel to most of these places where people were. That was really cool as well. Yeah.
Nice. I was wondering because I kind of as a last thought, I know traditionally software used to have, I think mostly kind of a license model. And nowadays we have this kind of product-led open source part, right? They call it open core. Next.js is there with Vercel as kind of the profit model. And I've also seen companies try and do this, solve this chicken egg problem where they have something popular open source. They try and build a product around it to make it run easier and then try and find customers there, or people that already have a business with customers, but they want to kind of explode it. So they need that community part and they try and open source something. But I haven't seen it work out as well as Next.js and Vercel specifically. I don't know why it worked out like it has, basically. But I think it has a lot to do with kind of right time, right place, and listening a lot to kind of what the market needs. Where do you think web development is going to evolve specifically with frameworks? Because for me, Next.js was there. There's always many different frameworks. You have the more standard ones, but now you're also seeing meta frameworks kind of being created as well. And even another cycle of that. I'm not sure if people are losing sight of like fundamentals in JavaScript, which you definitely still need, but things are getting more abstraction layers. I feel like more and more.
I think like a big part of the abstraction layers is also that just things are getting more complicated.
Yeah.
And not more complicated in like a bad way. It's just that like there's more demands for more interactive apps or like websites or anything like that. And there's just like there's been a lot of development in this, like going from 2016 when we released Next.js, like I would have not expected like it's JavaScript framework, so maybe you could have expected that there's like many different frameworks now and many different UI libraries and like everyone trying to get their own like flavor of it.
Yeah.
But I also feel like personally, because I saw that like cycle of like React coming up and like I don't know jQuery and others being used less and all that. And I also didn't expect the current wave of frameworks to last this long, initially at least. It seems like that like this whole model of having a component layer, doesn't matter which library you're using to create a component layer. It's really like stuck around, and like what has been interesting is that like React and Vue have stayed so popular over time, basically, and grown in adoption. Not like basically it's similar to how you see like jQuery still being around. So like even if you look like 10 years ahead, it could be that like it's still the most popular solution, and like it's evolved over time. And obviously there's new shifts in all those frameworks as well, like more server first or server driven UIs. So like React Server Components, for example, that kind of thing. And then you see a lot of, you also see just like a lot more like capital going into all these frameworks as well. I think that's a good thing overall. It causes a like feedback loop of like you're doing it better than us, so we're going to make it just as good type thing, or better than what it was. I think it's really hard for like new frameworks to come in, like to get into this adoption space. So because the problem is that once you build something new, it needs to be like 10x better than what it was before.
Yeah.
And maybe like AI is going to help here, or like your framework is more optimized for the new thing that's coming up, right? So it's AI or crypto or Web3, that kind of thing, or the existing frameworks already support what you're doing, and that
they can outpace you.
And not per se based on like just resources, for example, because I definitely think that you could build a framework like Next.js yourself, but it needs a certain like type of like support and polish over time. So like what we've seen is like as the team has grown, like the user base has grown like 100 or 1000x plus, if not more.
Yeah.
Probably more actually. Like 1000x is still 120 people. Still like, yeah. So that's not, it's way more than that even. So like what we see is that per user that's using it, we have like a relatively limited amount of people working on the framework. obviously, if you're building a framework like from scratch, you don't have users, so you don't have to worry about anything. So you don't have to worry about breaking changes, for example, or like new releases, or are you releasing too often? Are you releasing too little? That kind of thing. And yeah, so that makes it harder to start like a new thing in this space. That if you want to, the thing is like, do you really want to make it like that large, or like that large adoption?
Yeah.
Especially if you're like one person, that might not be what you want per se, right? Because it might be that you get like burnt out on the amount of like questions you get from people, or like support requests that you get on your GitHub issues. But also if you're building it for like just your own, like I'm building my own website, or I'm building my own app, and like I have this framework because I need to have this framework, then it makes a lot more sense to work on it. And that's what like to add here, like that was what Vercel was doing. Vercel was just building it for themselves. We needed it for our own website, our own blog, our own like dashboards, that kind of thing. And we're still using it today. Like that app is literally 8 years old.
That's really cool.
And it's gone through all these like iterations of all the different versions, and like using Turbopack now as well. So like a lot of the incentive that, like a lot of times, like I see people saying like the incentive for Vercel is to sell you more hosting, but there's a lot of incentive for us to make Next.js better for just our own people working on it.
Yeah.
And we're making everything more efficient as well. Like we're making the compilation faster, we're making rendering faster, like that kind of thing. So there's a lot of like work to be done basically on making like everything that you're using faster. I think like we're seeing similar things for like all other like libraries, frameworks out there. And some created a company around it, which I think is a good thing. It's just like the business model that Vercel has is very unique, I think, because it's not based on like having you use Next.js per se.
Yeah.
So like the business itself is not a like Next.js enterprise. Like Next.js Enterprise Edition in the sense of like Magento Enterprise Edition or things like that, where you get particular features that are only available on Vercel that are part of the framework. And that is one of the strengths as well that we've seen like over time. We're working with like a bunch of different like cloud providers now to create like a deeper integration into like their particular like hosting environment as well.
That's really nice. I wouldn't have thought that would be like a big benefit specifically, right? But it makes sense that, I mean, a lot of enterprise software, or at least enterprise editions, what I've seen is indeed they nudge you with specific features to then get a paid version, basically, right? They lock you in with a free model and then you go more towards the paid version. But I think as long as the company has people that basically sees adoption, see usage, and then are like, but we can do it faster or we can optimize it more, right? I think it makes people more happy from a usage standpoint, from something they deliver from both sides. If adoption creates happiness, then also that is kind of that piece of fulfillment that you want. And it's not only financially driven, which I think is valuable.
Well, we see, at least what I've seen a lot is that like the people that come to us, they're often more so like, hey, we have the scaling problem, not the hey, we have this Next.js problem per se.
Yeah.
So it's more like we're under such large load over time, like that we're that we could hire like your entire team in terms of like DevOps people to keep it online, basically, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's where that's what I find really interesting about it, because that they don't come to us because we obviously because we host Next.js really well, and like your app is really fast to put in Vercel. But what we see in like some customers is that they like it because they get preview environments and they can send it to their colleagues or to their like customers as well. or they just like the performance of the production environment, or they like not having to set up their servers or things like that.
Yeah.
And we can do everything we can to make sure that like your app stays performant as well. So like monitoring tooling and things like that are being added into the platform as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on, Tim. This was a real blast. Learning from how you started and kind of how things have grown. It must be insane. Like you started so early and how big things have gotten now. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing. Is there anything you still want to share before we round off?
Just that if you want to learn Next.js and like you're interested in that, there's a really good Learn course on the website that is fully free. Like we were just giving it away. That is like really interactive. So like what I like personally is that I learn a lot by doing. Like I said, like I learned JavaScript and like getting better at programming by going through GitHub issues. But I also like that like our tutorial is really like interactive. So you're building an app or like a website that is it's like just like as you go through the course, you just like get something real basically that you can deploy in the end. Yeah.
Awesome. Send it to me. I'll make sure it's in the description.
Yeah, it's just Next.js.org/learn. Yeah.
Perfect. We'll do that then. Thank you so much for listening. If you're still around, leave a like if you'd like to, leave a comment and let us know what you think of the episode. We'll see you on the next one.